Johnny Carson exposed the 9 Golden Age guests who were evil. For 30 years, Johnny Carson introduced America's largest stars into living rooms nationwide. His affable smile and comfortable laugh made audiences feel as if they were seeing old friends have coffee and chat with each other. But when the cameras ceased and the audience packed up and went home, Carson's smile faded away. America's favorite host had a mental blacklist of those guests he felt were absolutely horrible human beings, according to those who knew him best. Johnny was the consummate pro in front of the camera, said a former Tonight Show producer who worked with Carson for more than a decade. But the moment we'd go to commercial, he'd occasionally lean over to Ed and say in a stage whisper, that individual should never have a camera or a child anywhere near him or her. Carson grew more frank in his later years about the stars he secretly disliked during his years in the public eye. Tales of his close friends tell a nauseating tale of revered idols who were beasts behind polished personas. The most surprising were Carson's disclosures about one great actress who had seemed sweet and fragile on his couch, yet backstage had been verbally attacking a young production assistant so brutally that security had to step in. And the venerable male star Carson caught doing something so repulsive in his dressing room that the host came close to calling the police. These were not just challenging personalities or high-maintenance stars. To Carson, they were truly dark individuals masquerading behind talent and fame. Predators, manipulators, and abusers the industry shielded for decades. But we need to find out why the first person on Carson's list received his strongest disdain and the private backstage confrontation no one has ever disclosed until now. Well, for starters, I'm stage-struck, and I think they all know that. Second, I attempt to acquire a movie with audience identification. Joan Crawford, the ice in her veins, Hollywood queen. When Joan Crawford guested on The Tonight Show in 1970, audiences glimpsed the elegant Hollywood legend they'd revered for decades. With her impeccable posture, spotless appearance, and rehearsed charm, Crawford oozed old Hollywood glamour. But from several Tonight Show employees, Crawford's offstage demeanor showed a very different individual. She was one of the coldest people I've ever interviewed, Carson allegedly said to his biographer years later. Like interviewing a pretty statue with no one inside. Crawford's looks started to be a problem even before she made it to the studio. Her requests involved precise lighting specifications, so precise that the technical director of the show decades later still had the 4-page memo in his files. All had to be exact, remembered a former producer. The slant of her chair, the level of Johnny's desk, even the studio temperature, precisely 67 degrees, not 66, not 68. When Crawford finally showed up 3 hours before taping, she brought her own makeup artists. Even though the show employed award-winning makeup artists, but what really exposed Crawford's personality was the way she treated individuals differently, depending on their level of importance. She pretty much curtsied to Johnny, mentioned a stagehand who was there that day. But when a young production assistant inadvertently entered her dressing room, carrying water she had asked for, Crawford blew up. Several witnesses reported that Crawford went into a rage so vicious that staffers in the hallway stopped dead in their tracks. She purportedly called the assistant, a 20-year-old woman new to the business, a brainless little __, and offered to have her take a job at a brothel where incompetence would be valuable. The young woman ran from the set in tears, and Crawford insisted on her being fired. Carson's producer refused, and tension simmered all through the taping. But the most shocking thing about Crawford's appearance wasn't the way she treated personnel. It was the deliberating manner in which she changed the instant cameras rolled. She was a machine feigning a woman, remembered one producer. She had memorized every response, every giggle, every improvised moment. None of it was natural. Over commercial breaks, Crawford would fall into stone-cold silence, not uttering a word to anyone, only to reanimate the instant the red light flashed back on. Carson, known for his ability to make guests comfortable, struggled to find any authentic connection with Crawford. After the show, he reportedly told Ed McMahon, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years later, when Christina Crawford's memoir, Mommy Dearest, revealed Joan's alleged abuse of her adopted children, Carson wasn't surprised. According to his close friends, he merely nodded and stated, "I saw who she really was in those few hours. I believe every word." But if Crawford's calculating coolness shocked Carson, his next adversary embodied something he found even more repellent: raw power employed to intimidate and threaten. I can respond to that by saying that in those nice times, I played Daphne and Chloe, or the Frank Sinatra, the suave bully Carson disliked. On screen, Frank Sinatra and Johnny Carson seemed to enjoy a polite, even affable rapport. The legendary singer would joke, spin yarns, and sing, sometimes, while Carson was the deferential host. Behind the scenes, Carson is said to have had a strong dislike of Sinatra, not for his skill, which Carson admired, but for the way that Blue Eyes treated others when he believed that no one important was observing. If he didn't perform, he'd be a mob muscle man, Carson said once to a friend, according to several biographies. And occasionally, I think he was both. Sinatra's shows on The Tonight Show were legendary among staff for the tension they generated. Longtime staff reported that Sinatra would show up with an entourage of as many as 8 men who were characterized as not show business types, but rather guys you don't want to run into in an alley. These guys would filter through the studio viewing personnel and establish an environment one cameraman called akin to having a surveillance. What appalled Carson, though, was seeing how Sinatra treated individuals he considered below him. On one 1970s-era appearance, a floor manager erred by informing Sinatra of the typical 3 minutes warning prior to his spot. Sinatra supposedly grabbed the man by the tie and pulled him in, exclaiming, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The floor manager, a Korean War vet in his 50s, was clearly shaken afterwards. When Carson witnessed this exchange on his office monitor, he almost canceled the segment. Only the producer's reminder of the ratings that Sinatra would guarantee persuaded him to go on. Another source of friction was Sinatra's dependability or lack thereof. He reportedly canceled shows at the last minute several times, including once just 2 hours prior to taping when he was already at the building, but then decided that he wasn't in the mood. The most telling moment came when, during a commercial break, Sinatra made a derogatory remark about the appearance of a female member of the staff loudly enough for those around him to hear. Carson, abandoning his customary professional reserve, icily replied, "We do not speak about my staff that way here." The atmosphere was tense, with Sinatra visibly taken aback that anyone, let alone Johnny Carson, would call him out. When the cameras came back, the 2 men had their professional covers intact, but crew members did observe that Carson's questions grew significantly shorter and less participatory. Following that appearance, Carson supposedly informed his producer, "I don't care what his ratings are. Limit him to once a year maximum." What is most noteworthy here is that Carson did not frequently get himself involved in booking decisions and hardly ever banned guests entirely. For him to limit Sinatra's appearances said a lot about his individual dislike of the singer's conduct. Whereas Sinatra epitomized the bullying aspect of star power, Carson's next troublesome guest embodied another type of challenging: the insufferable ego that knew no limits or structures. Now, the counterargument to what I'm saying is that the world is full. All the good young directors are saturated. Orson Welles, the genius who believed rules were below him. Orson Welles guested on The Tonight Show several times during the Carson reign, always creating iconic television with his thundering voice, larger-than-life personality, and superb stories from his illustrious career. Home viewers saw a witty, gifted racer. Carson and his employees saw something else: a man whose ego had swelled so big that he felt regular rules of television just didn't exist for him. Never again, Carson supposedly vowed after a particularly tough Welles appearance. That fellow is still imagining himself in charge of Rome. The issues generally started before Welles even set foot in the studio. As Tonight Show writers described, Welles would regularly brush aside any prepared questions or ideas that Carson's staff had created. He told us our questions were mundane and trivial, one former writer remembered. He actually struck them all out and returned an empty sheet. This left Carson in the awkward situation of having to interview one of the cinema's greatest figures without preparation or context. a challenge made all the more difficult by Wells's habit of starting off with long, rambling yarns that were hard to cut for time. In one appearance during the mid-1970s, Wells was booked for a 7-minute segment. He remained on the couch for almost 25 minutes, disregarding several subtle signals from Carson that it was time to get off. Johnny